Hello everyone, welcome back to the channel. Today we turn our attention to recent events in the south of Ukraine, specifically the reported explosions in Melitopol and their potential implications for the so-called land bridge linking the annexed Crimea Peninsula to mainland Russia. In early April, multiple explosions rocked Melitopol, a city under Russian occupation, and one long described by analysts as the gateway to Crimea. Russian-aligned local authorities immediately raised alarms about a possible Ukrainian counter-offensive. At face value, the blasts suggest a significant disruption to supply lines and a signal-type strike deep behind the front. Melitopol is located in Ukraine's Zaporizhzhia region, southeast of the front lines and between major occupied territories. Because of this position, Melitopol serves as a logistics hub for Russian forces moving men, material, and equipment toward Crimea and other southern fronts. Control of Melitopol gives either side leverage over supply and movement. The longer the land corridor linking Russia through southern Ukraine to Crimea stays open, the more resupply, reinforcement, and evacuation capabilities Russia retains. If that corridor is severed or degraded, it introduces additional friction and constraint on Russian operations. When explosions hit Melitopol, the question immediately becomes, were these strikes aimed at severing that supply route, or at least placing heavy stress on it? Reports suggest that the blasts occurred while the region was already on heightened alert, and Russian occupation authorities warned of imminent Ukrainian military action. This suggests the strikes may have been part of a Ukrainian strategy aimed at deep logistics disruption rather than solely tactical gains. Logistics disruption has become increasingly prominent in this war. Both sides recognize that movement of heavy systems, ammunition, fuel, and maintenance behind the front is critical. Hitting these lines causes delays, forces rerouting, forces resource-intensive repairs, and forces the adversary's attention away from offensive operations toward defense and fix-up. The significance of Melitopol is less about the city's population or frontline value, and more about its role as a node in the broader Russian supply network. We should also consider alternative possibilities. It might be that the explosions were the result of internal sabotage inside occupied territory, perhaps from local resistance or infiltrators. It might also be that Russian forces mismanaged munitions or infrastructure and the blasts are accidental. However, given the timing and the immediate warnings of counterattack by the occupiers, the indication tilts toward deliberate action aligned with Ukraine's broader operational logic. If the land bridge were cut off or degraded significantly, we would expect to see delays in reinforcements and supply convoys heading into Crimea or the southern occupied territories, increased reliance on sea or air resupply, more pressure on Russian supply lines from Ukraine targeting adjacent roads, rail, or bridges, and perhaps a window of opportunity for Ukraine to press ground advances while the adversary is logistically stretched. For Russia, the ramifications of such disruption are serious. Its southern front has historically depended on the overland route through Melitopol to keep the Crimea front viable. If this route is under threat, Russia may have to divert resources from offensive operations to rear area security, route repair, alternative logistics, or defensive posture reinforcement. This shift could blunt Russian momentum, increase their costs, reduce sustainment, and impose greater vulnerability to further Ukrainian strikes. For Ukraine, the benefits of hitting Melitopol, or at least signaling the ability to strike there, are also significant. It demonstrates reach deep into occupied territory, signals to Russian-backed forces that no rear area is inviolate, boosts morale, and opens the possibility for a strategic operational pause in Russian logistics. It may set the conditions for a Ukrainian southern push or exploitation of a weak Russian flank. Disrupting a logistics route is easier said than done. Such routes often have redundancy, alternate paths, bypasses, and adaptability. Russia may simply repair roads, reroute through other territories, or shift to more expensive but safer supply lines. Even if Melitopol's role is diminished temporarily, full severance may be unrealistic without sustained Ukrainian pressure and ground gains. Furthermore, terrain, weather, fortifications, and Russian defensive depth in the south all favor a slow grind rather than rapid breakthrough. Early April is well after the major front line engagements of 2022-2023, and as Ukraine has settled into a pattern of targeting rear areas, logistics, and infrastructure rather than only frontline attrition. The fact that Melitopol, once considered relatively stable under occupation, is now vulnerable suggests a shift in Ukrainian operational approach, probably improved intelligence, increased use of long-range strike assets, and an emphasis on disrupting rather than simply holding ground. This reflects a broader adaptation in the war that some analysts have described as moving from frontal attacks to deep maneuver in depth. From Russia's perspective, the response is telling. Reports of occupation, authorities warning of counter-attacks at the same time show increased concern about Ukraine's next move. If Russia feels the need to publicly caution civilians or occupiers about possible Ukrainian strikes, it suggests that the rear is no longer as secure as it wants to project. That, in itself, has an effect. Troops may feel more exposed, logistics convoys may proceed more cautiously, and supply chain efficiency may fall. In war, perception shapes reality as much as bombs do. Disruptions in a logistics corridor inevitably impact civilians. Supplies of food, water, and electricity for occupied or frontline areas may suffer. Civilian transport, evacuations, and aid flows may be curtailed. If Melitopol becomes a contested logistics node, the human cost may increase. Displacement, interruption of services, greater risk for the civilian population under occupation. Ukraine also faces the moral dimension. While strikes may help shorten the war and reduce long-term suffering, they also risk collateral damage in occupied zones where civilians live and infrastructure is intertwined. In the broader southern theater of war, the northeast of Crimea and southern Ukrainian regions have seen increased activity. Strikes against bridges, depots, transport nodes, and energy infrastructure. These kinds of operations show the strategic logic Ukraine is pursuing. Instead of attacking the heavily fortified front line head-on, hit the lifelines of the logistics network and force Russia into a defensive posture. In that sense, Melitopol fits the pattern. A rear logistics node, exposed behind the lines, vulnerable to asymmetric strike. Execution remains complex. Ukraine must sustain pressure, follow through with multiple strikes, exploit vulnerabilities, and ideally couple logistics disruption with maneuver on the ground. If the land bridge is only partially degraded but Russia adapts quickly, the strategic gain may remain limited. That means we should be watching for additional strikes around Melitopol, rails and roads feeding into it, supply depots, and any shift in Russian traffic or routing that signals stress. We should also watch for Ukrainian ground activity in the Zaporizhzhia-Melitopol axis, such as probing attacks, raids, or prepared offensives, to exploit any moment of Russian logistic weakness. Targeting Melitopol also carries symbolic weight. It communicates to domestic Ukrainian audiences that the country is not passive, that occupation zones remain vulnerable, which supports morale and political support for the war effort. To Russia, it is a reminder that occupation carries cost, that gaze must be turned rearwards, and that lines once considered safe may no longer be. Internationally, such operations signal to actors supplying Ukraine or considering negotiations that the conflict remains dynamic, and that Ukraine retains initiative in certain domains. The explosions at Melitopol are not just random blasts. They likely form part of a calculated strategy by Ukraine to strain or sever Russia's overland link to Crimea, a link vital for Russian operations in the south. While this does not guarantee an imminent Ukrainian breakthrough or a collapse of Russian supply in the south, it raises the pressure, imposes additional cost on the occupier, and opens operational opportunities. It also signals that the war is evolving, with logistics, infrastructure, and deep strike increasingly central. For viewers, what to watch next? Are there follow-up strikes in the Melitopol area or along adjacent supply roads? Does Russian logistic traffic visibly decrease, shift routes, or become slower? Are there Ukrainian ground moves in the Zaporizhzhia region that appear timed to exploit logistic stress? Are civilian supply flows and infrastructure in occupied territories showing signs of disruption? And how does Russia respond? Do they reinforce, relocate logistics, build alternate routes, or increase rear area defense? As always in war, change comes not only from the front lines, but also from the rear where lines of supply, repair, movement, and morale connect the battlefield. The explosions in Melitopol underscore that fact. They remind us that while the line of contact may freeze or creep, the war remains dynamic behind the scenes. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next breakdown.